There's a lot being made about the tearing down of statues. I imagine, I can certainly theorize that there are some statues that I would say I don't think deserve to be taken down. I think some are way overdue for being taken down. The Natural History Museum has announced that they are, with the permission of the city, they're going to remove the Teddy Roosevelt statue that is out in front of the building, where he is flanked by a black guy and an indigenous guy. And really, apparently, the basis of the statue was very much about sort of showing the racial superiority of Teddy Roosevelt. And it's been up there since 1940. The museum is making a decision that, like, it's problematic. This representation is problematic, so we're getting rid of it. And the idea that it's a destruction of history, or that it is recasting some type of, the idea that these statues were divorced from, were just objectively true and did not reflect in the moment that they were installed an ideology is absurd. And the idea that that ideology is any more relevant or important to maintain through that iconography in that moment and shouldn't be done now is absurd. Most of the statues that are being pulled down in terms of the Confederates were built in 1920 or in the 1920s, because there was a resurgence of I don't know if it was ever as large as it was during the 20s, early 20s, of the KKK in this country. And there was an ideology of white supremacy. I mean, you have Confederate statues in many places that have nothing to do with the Confederacy. And the idea that these statues weren't built based upon an ideology of the time, but that they were there as some type of objective representation of history is absurd. It is absurd. And those people who suggest, and they come from various, frankly, sectors of our politics, I've noticed lately. Those people who suggest that this is somehow an attack on history and reality are simply just ignoring the fact, very conveniently, that these were ideological statements.
Oh, I think they know.
Yes, I think they know. But they're pretending that they're not. And they're ideological statements that now our society believes are bad ideologies. And so it's not a question of disappearing the history. In fact, every single person who calls for the pulling down of a Confederate statue, every single person, the vast majority of people who call for that, who call for the renaming of, let's say, military bases or whatever it is, I think would be very, very interested in more of the history being told. More history of that era when you had 6% of the country were card-carrying members of the KKK, or Reconstruction, or Jim Crow. We need more of that history. And I am perfectly on board with the idea of, like, for every one of those statues that comes down, there needs to be another class in their elementary schools, in their junior highs, in their high schools, teaching more of that history. That history should be so explicit. In fact, every single one of those guys whose statue's been turned down, we should know everything about them.
How many slaves did he own?
How many slaves? How many did they use as, basically to rape? How many people were killed in the name of maintaining that economic system of free labor and abused labor and completely commodified human beings? I'm on board for that.
Mm-hmm.
Here is Brian Kilmeade worrying about, I didn't mean to go on that long rant about that, but here is Brian Kilmeade going on to say that it's really wrong to criticize Jefferson for having slaves. This is sort of bizarre construction, but check this out.
Jefferson went into a society where his parents had slaves. Slavery is abhorrent, but it was everywhere on earth, not just in the United States, as some would thought is right. We'll never, ever be able to get our head around how the smartest people on the planet could rationalize this horrible behavior. But the smartest people on the planet gave us the country we're in that allowed us to grow and change and progress, that was built into the Constitution. Right. So you don't wipe them out of history. You don't say they don't matter. You're going to have a history book, social studies, 5th grade. It's going to be nothing but blank pages.
But well, of course that's not going to happen. It's just a question of, the idea that statues are history in and of themselves. No, they are things that are there to express pride, and they are vehicles in which they are commemorating. It's not history. History is learning about these things and learning the good and the bad. If you had a statue of Jefferson depicted with the viciousness of his slave owning, I don't think people would want to see it, frankly, every day, but maybe they should. But you're not depicting history in that moment. You're venerating somebody without any critical assessment of who they are or what they're doing. And the idea, no, it's the opposite. These statues are obfuscating history. They are not teaching us it.
Well, they're telling their own version of it. I mean,
yes.
maybe they should write on the bases, statues are not endorsements.
Right, exactly.
A lot of people like Crowder have been saying, well, what about the Lincoln statues? And it's like, if a Lincoln statue looks like this one does, yeah, like tear this down. It's creepy and weird.
Yes. I agree. It is we can go into describing why. I mean, the idea that like this was emancipation was just something that, Lincoln bestowed upon these people who were not even, who were literally bowing down to him as if he was some type of
He had a great
god.
idea, just a great idea one day.
Yeah, I mean, slave uprisings played a huge role in emancipation as well.
Of course, exactly. It was an untenable system. But the idea that these people, this was a godlike thing to do.
That wasn't even his primary motivation getting into the Civil War.
But even if it was, like, it's hard to imagine that Lincoln perceived himself to be godlike in the face of slaves. But B, if he did, why would you celebrate that? Like, it's like either it is inconsistent with Lincoln's perspective or it's consistent with Lincoln's perspective and it's an offensive and wrong-headed perspective. If you want to create a satire or you want to make a comment that depicts the notion that Lincoln was twisted and saw himself as some type of god who had the ability, a deified ability to liberate the slaves, then depict that. But that statue does not read that way. That statue reads like he's a god. Mm-hmm. And these people are bowing down to him because he delivered them.
Like, oh my God, thank you.
It's basically the great man theory of history objectified.
Yeah, pretty much. The thing I like about the statues going away is that people are doing it themselves. And that's always the best way to do stuff. You don't write to your congressperson. You don't speak to the manager. You just wrap a chain around it, get some folks together. Boom. Empowerment.
I personally, I think what I would like the part that I like better is when cities and towns respond to what's going on, and it makes them actually assess it, think about it, and make a public decree that as a society, we're no longer going to venerate these people. That I like better. But
well, that often follows from the first thing.
Indeed. Agreed. That's the part I like about it. So it looks like Trump is going to Arizona on Tuesday. He's just doing his Corona hotspot tour. Then he's heading to Wisconsin for a speech at a shipyard. Let's talk about that Teddy Roosevelt statue that Brian Kilmeade, he can't handle. That they're taking down the Roosevelt statue in front of the Natural History Museum. Let's see if there's an image of this statue in this clip, because it's offensive, and they've been thinking about doing this for a while. The museum has, and the only hesitation, Roosevelt was very key, and there's plenty of things that are named after Roosevelt in the Natural History Museum, because it was largely a function of the Roosevelt family that this museum exists. And it's a great museum, and they should get credit for it. But this, where you're basically just, again, celebrating the conquest of Black people and indigenous people by Teddy Roosevelt, I think is problematic.
Let's move every statue of every single person that is not perfect or that.
Yeah, okay. So we're stopping right there. This is not a question of removing the statue because Teddy Roosevelt is not perfect. It is basically like just sort of like, look at what I've conquered. Maybe that's something that we shouldn't be necessarily proud of. And it's not like well, good.
Or that is not reminiscent of 2020. This is reminiscent of its time. It's history.
Brian, but here's the thing. As you look at the closer detail, it's Teddy Roosevelt, and he's flanked by an African-American and by somebody who was
Native American.
A Native American, exactly. And so, for a long time here in New York City, there have been people who have objected because they have said it's a symbol of colonialism and of racism. But what's different about this is...
He's not even part of colonialism.
What's different about this particular movement is the museum, where it sits in front, says, you know what, we're going to take it down. President Trump tweeted out, ridiculous, don't do it. And then we hear this morning in the pages of the New York Times, Theodore Roosevelt IV, who is Teddy Roosevelt's, obviously, heir, says take it down. It's time to take it down.
I don't know. I wonder what the people in Philippines might think about his colonialism.
That's imperialism, Sam, not colonialism, okay?
Fact check. Every U.S. president is a part of colonialism because this is a settler colonial nation.
What does he think is being communicated? I wonder what he thinks.
He thinks it was colonial times. So he thinks like anything pre-revolution is colonial and everything post is.
But I would like to sit down with Kilmeade and just be like, so what do you think, though, is being communicated by that statue?
Yeah, if it's part of its history and it's from its time, what do you think they were communicating when they put that up?
Yeah, I'm very curious as to what is the read on that statue that is like, that's something that we should remind people of every day they walk by it. Or that's something that we should remind people of whenever they enter into this natural history museum. Like, what is it that we're reminding them of? If you have Teddy Roosevelt on a horse alone, okay, he's out there. He was he was very well known for his conservation I don't know if a horse, maybe you could say that that's like him.
Just put him in
indicative
front of
of him.
Yosemite or something. So like he helped establish this, system in this country that people, respect as part of conservation efforts.
Right. This is an image of him riding through the West or something like that.
Yeah, there's Rough Rider statues of Teddy Roosevelt all over North Dakota, for instance.
Yeah. But what
Focus
is
on
it
the
that
good parts.
What is it that people think is being communicated? I want to hear like the good interpretation, the interpretation of that statue that we should feel proud of, and it should necessarily be there. Like, what history is it? Are we venerating with that in brass?
It's a little bit like, this is the original flag of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and it has a Native American saying, "Come over and help us," out of a speech bubble.
Wow.
How did you get that, Matt? How did you find that? Because they're not flying that flag anymore. I thought that history was completely erased.
Yeah, I mean, that's an argument for...
How is it that you found that?
History books, actually, which Kilmeade apparently writes. But
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe they like diversity in statues. They're like, look, you guys are always complaining about how all the statues are of old dead white men, and then we make a black statue and a Native American one, and like, you're not even happy.
You're not even happy.